You think you know what terror looks like? You think your species has seen the worst the universe can offer? I am Sci-Fi, a reconnaissance specialist for the Galactic Confederation, and I have spent 3 rotations documenting what we believe to be a primitive, quarantined species on the third planet of a yellow dwarf star. We called them humans, and we thought we understood them. We were catastrophically wrong. What I witnessed in their conflict zones didn't just challenge everything we knew about warfare, strategy, and survival. It shattered our fundamental understanding of what intelligent life could become when pushed to its absolute limits. The recordings I smuggled back have been classified at the highest levels, buried so deep that even the High Council pretends they don't exist. But the truth has a way of demanding to be told. These are not stories of heroes and villains. These are accounts of a species that looked into the abyss of extinction and chose to become something that even nightmares fear. I have seen civilizations rise and fall across 17 star systems, witnessed the birth and death of empires that span galaxies. Nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what humans become when everything they love hangs in the balance. The first time I saw a human smile while bleeding out, still fighting to save others, I realized we hadn't discovered a primitive species. We had found something that would either save the galaxy or doom us all. This is my testimony. This is my warning. This is why the stars themselves have learned to fear a species that refuses to surrender, refuses to break, and refuses to die quietly. Welcome to the hidden war that changed everything. Sci-Fi adjusted the quantum resonance field around his observation pod, ensuring complete invisibility as he descended through the atmosphere of Sol 3. The planet the locals called Earth had been under covert surveillance for exactly 47 standard rotations, ever since the Confederation's deep space monitors detected the first electromagnetic signatures suggesting tool use among the bipedal mammals that dominated the landmasses. The mission briefing had been routine. Monitor, catalog, assess threat level, recommend quarantine duration. Standard procedure for a species that had recently discovered atomic manipulation but hadn't yet achieved faster than light travel. The Confederation had been through this process thousands of times across the galaxy. Most species took between 50 to 100 rotations to develop space-worthy technology after splitting the atom. The dangerous ones, the ones that might pose a threat to galactic stability, usually revealed themselves through their approach to warfare during this critical development period. Humans, according to all preliminary reports, appeared to be following the standard pattern. They had developed nuclear weapons, yes, but had shown remarkable restraint in their use. Only 2 deployments in active warfare, both against their own species, followed by decades of cautious deterrence rather than widespread destruction. Their conflicts were typically territorial, resource-based, or ideological, nothing unusual for a developing civilization. The assessment committee had classified them as standard development track, low threat potential, recommended monitoring, minimal. Sci-Fi's role was to provide final verification of this assessment by conducting direct observation of their military capabilities during active conflicts. It should have been a simple 3-cycle assignment. Document their tactics, assess their strategic thinking, file a report recommending they remain under quarantine for another 50 rotations until they achieved interstellar travel naturally. The observation pod settled into position above what human military communications identified as the Helmand Province, Afghanistan. Intelligence suggested this region was experiencing what humans classified as asymmetric warfare, a conflict between a technologically advanced military force and indigenous fighters using primitive weapons and guerrilla tactics. Perfect for observing both their advanced capabilities and their response to unconventional threats. Sci-Fi activated his recording systems and began monitoring local communications. The language barriers had been solved weeks ago through pattern analysis and quantum translation matrices. What he heard initially seemed to confirm every assumption about human warfare patterns. Delta 7-2, this is Overwatch. We have eyes on 3 possible hostiles approaching your position from the northeast ridge. How copy? Overwatch, Delta 7-2 copies. We see them. Looks like they're carrying AK pattern weapons and what might be explosives. Request permission to engage if they present a threat to the village. Delta 7-2, you are clear to engage if directly threatened. Rules of engagement remain in effect. Protect civilians at all costs. Standard military protocol. Structured command hierarchy, clear rules governing the use of force, concern for non-combatant casualties. Textbook behavior for a species developing mature warfare ethics. Zeftai made notes in his observation log and prepared to document what he expected would be a brief skirmish followed by tactical withdrawal or surrender. He was prepared for tactics and strategy. He was prepared for weapons and technology. He was not prepared for what humans actually are. The three individuals moving toward the human position were indeed armed, but, as Zeftai's sensors provided detailed analysis, he realized they weren't military combatants in any conventional sense. Two appeared to be barely past adolescence by human standards, perhaps 16 or 17 solar cycles old. The third was older, maybe 40 cycles, walking with the pronounced limp that suggested an old injury. Their weapons were ancient by human military standards, ammunition appeared limited, and their tactical positioning was amateur at best. By every military doctrine Zeftai had studied across 43 different species, this should have been a brief engagement. The humans possessed overwhelming technological superiority, superior positioning, better training, and vastly superior equipment. The approaching individuals posed minimal tactical threat and could have been neutralized with minimal effort and risk. What happened next changed everything Zeftai thought he knew about warfare, about intelligence, and about the species he was observing. Instead of immediately engaging the armed individuals, the human patrol did something unprecedented in Zeftai's experience. They waited. Not a tactical wait for superior positioning or optimal firing solutions, but a wait that seemed designed to understand intent rather than simply eliminate threat. Overwatch, Delta 7-2. The individuals have stopped approximately 400 meters from the village outskirts. They appear to be arguing among themselves. The youngest one is gesturing back in the direction they came from. The older individual keeps pointing toward the village. Copy, Delta 7-2. Maintain observation. Do not engage unless directly threatened or unless civilians are endangered. For the next 23 minutes, the human patrol watched three armed individuals engage in what appeared to be an intense debate. During this time, they made no attempt to call in artillery support, airstrikes, or additional ground forces that could have ended the situation instantly. Instead, they gathered intelligence, assessed intentions, and waited. Finally, the youngest of the three armed individuals broke away from the group and began walking back the way they had come. The older individual appeared to argue with him briefly, then shouldered his weapon and followed. Only the middle individual remained, and, after several minutes of apparent internal struggle, he also began to withdraw. Overwatch, all three individuals are withdrawing. No shots fired. No engagement necessary. Outstanding work, Delta 7-2. Return to base for debrief. Zeftai stared at his recordings in confusion. In 47 years of military observation across dozens of species, he had never seen a technologically superior force voluntarily allow armed hostiles to approach and withdraw without either engaging or demanding surrender. The tactical doctrine made no sense. The strategic implications were unclear. The decision-making process appeared to prioritize unknown variables over immediate security. But, as the human patrol prepared to return to their base, something else happened that forced Zeftai to completely re-evaluate his understanding of the situation. A child emerged from the village. The sensor readings indicated a human female, approximately 7 solar cycles old, who had apparently been watching the entire encounter from a concealed position. As the armed patrol passed near the village outskirts, she approached them. What followed was a conversation that Zeftai's translation systems captured in real time, and which would haunt his dreams for cycles to come. "Thank you for not shooting them," the child said in the local dialect. The patrol leader, a human male designated Sergeant Martinez according to their communications, knelt down to speak with her at eye level. "Do you know who those men were, sweetheart? The young one is Farid. His family grows wheat in the next valley. The older one is his uncle, Hassan. Hassan lost his leg when the bad men came to their village last year. The middle one. I don't know him. But Farid is good. He gave me bread once when I was hungry." Sergeant Martinez was quiet for several seconds. When he spoke, his voice carried an emotional undertone that Zeftai's analysis systems struggled to categorize. Farid and his uncle were carrying weapons, little one. That usually means they want to fight or hurt people. The child considered this seriously. My father says sometimes good people have to carry weapons because bad people won't listen to words. He says the difference is what they do with the weapons, not whether they have them. Your father sounds like a smart man. He was. The bad men killed him last winter. But, before he died, he told me that good people try to understand before they try to fight. He said that's what makes them good. Sergeant Martinez was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, your father was right. We try very hard to understand first. I know. That's why I'm not afraid of you, even though you have big weapons. You wait and watch and try to understand. The bad men never wait. They just hurt people right away. As the patrol moved away from the village, Zeftai heard Sergeant Martinez speaking quietly to his radio operator. Central, Delta 7-2. Request intel update on local tribal movements in Grid 77 Alpha. Specifically looking for information about recent attacks on villages in the adjacent valley system. We may have had contact with displaced civilians rather than hostile combatants. Recommend follow-up humanitarian assessment. Copy, Delta 7-2. Will coordinate with Intel and Humanitarian Affairs for comprehensive area assessment. Zeftai spent the next several hours reviewing his recordings and attempting to understand what he had witnessed. According to every military doctrine he had studied, the human response made no tactical sense. They had allowed potential threats to approach and withdraw without gathering intelligence about their capabilities, intentions, or affiliations. They had prioritized civilian input over tactical security. They had requested resource allocation for humanitarian purposes based on a conversation with a child. By every standard of military efficiency and strategic doctrine, their behavior was demonstrably suboptimal. But, as Zeftai continued monitoring the region, something unprecedented began to unfold. Over the next several cycles, the information gathered during that single encounter led to the discovery and dismantling of an entire terrorist cell that had been operating in the region for over 2 solar years. The humanitarian assessment identified 17 separate villages that had been attacked or threatened, leading to coordinated security operations that eliminated multiple genuine threat groups. More significantly, the 3 individuals who had initially approached the village, Farid, his uncle Hassan, and the unidentified third person, began providing intelligence about terrorist movements in the region. They became, according to human military terminology, valuable assets in the broader campaign against actual hostile forces. The tactical decision to wait, observe, and understand rather than immediately engage had transformed 3 potential enemies into allies, protected civilian populations, and generated actionable intelligence that directly contributed to strategic objectives. Zeftai realized he was observing something that shouldn't be possible. The humans weren't just conducting military operations. They were conducting military operations while simultaneously maintaining ethical frameworks, humanitarian considerations, and strategic flexibility that should have been mutually contradictory. They were fighting a war while refusing to stop being human. As his first cycle of observation concluded, Zeftai updated his preliminary report. Human military doctrine appears inconsistent with established patterns. Further observation required. Initial assessment, inconclusive. What he didn't include in his official report was the growing certainty that he was observing something unprecedented in galactic history. A species that had somehow learned to wage war without losing their fundamental nature. A species that treated enemies as potential allies, that valued understanding over victory, that measured success not just in territory gained or enemies defeated, but in civilians protected and communities preserved. It should have been impossible. Every military doctrine suggested that such an approach would lead to defeat, exploitation, and, ultimately extinction. But, as Zeftai prepared for his second cycle of observation, the humans continued to not only survive but thrive in one of the most complex and dangerous conflict environments he had ever studied. Something was happening on Sol 3 that challenged everything the Confederation understood about warfare, intelligence, and survival. Something that suggested these primitive bipeds might be far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. Not because they were better at killing, but because they had found a way to fight without losing their souls. Zeftai's second cycle of observation began in what human military designations called Fallujah, Iraq. The intelligence briefings had described this as an urban warfare environment where human forces were engaged in counterinsurgency operations against highly motivated hostile forces in complex terrain. The terminology seemed standard enough, but, after his experiences in Afghanistan, Zeftai had learned to expect the unexpected from human military doctrine. The observation pod settled into position above a city that showed extensive damage from ongoing conflict. Buildings bore the scars of explosive impacts, streets were cratered and debris-filled, and the electromagnetic signatures indicated significant military activity throughout the urban area. By every tactical assessment model Zeftai had been trained to use, this environment should have been approached with overwhelming force, area denial weapons, and minimal concern for infrastructure preservation. Instead, what he observed defied every principle of urban warfare he had studied across 43 different galactic civilizations. The human forces were conducting what they called precision operations in an environment where precision should have been tactically impossible. Rather than employing area effect weapons that would have quickly cleared hostile forces from defensive positions, they were conducting building by building, room by room operations that maximized their own risk while minimizing collateral damage. Zeftai's first detailed observation focused on a unit designated Alpha Company, 2nd Battalion, as they approached a multi-story structure that intelligence had identified as a stronghold for hostile forces. According to intercepted communications, the building contained an unknown number of combatants armed with automatic weapons, explosives, and defensive positions that could command the entire street. Standard urban warfare doctrine suggested three optimal approaches: aerial bombardment to collapse the structure, artillery strikes to neutralize defensive positions, or chemical weapons to force evacuation without structural damage. All three approaches would have minimized friendly casualties while achieving tactical objectives efficiently. The humans chose none of these options. Instead, they spent 47 minutes conducting reconnaissance to determine if civilians were present in the building or surrounding structures. When thermal imaging suggested the possibility of non-combatants on the upper floors, they developed what they called a precise extraction plan that would allow them to neutralize hostile forces while evacuating civilian populations. Bravo team, this is Alpha 6. Thermal shows at least 3 adult signatures and what looks like 2 smaller signatures on the 3rd floor, northeast corner. Could be families. We're going to have to do this the hard way. Copy, Alpha 6. Hard way it is. Charlie team is standing by for civilian evacuation support. Roger. Remember, people, we're here to get the bad guys and get everyone else home safely. Speed is important, but safety is more important. Everyone goes home today. What followed was a tactical operation that violated every principle of military efficiency Zeftai had been trained to recognize. The human forces coordinated a complex, multi-stage assault that involved simultaneous entry from 3 different access points to divide hostile attention, non-lethal suppression techniques to incapacitate rather than eliminate opponents when possible, real-time intelligence gathering to distinguish between combatants and civilians in chaotic conditions, and immediate medical aid for both friendly forces and captured hostiles. The operation took 4 hours and 17 minutes to complete. A standard bombardment could have achieved the same tactical objectives in fewer than 10 minutes. But, as Zeftai continued monitoring, he began to understand why the humans had chosen the more difficult approach. During the operation, they successfully evacuated 11 civilians from the building, including 2 children under 10 solar cycles old and an elderly human female who required medical assistance. They captured 7 hostile combatants alive, providing intelligence opportunities that would have been impossible if the building had been destroyed. They recovered weapons and explosive materials that provided forensic evidence about supply chains and manufacturing methods. Most significantly, they preserved the structural integrity of surrounding buildings that housed more than 40 civilian families. When the operation concluded, Zeftai observed something that fundamentally challenged his understanding of military psychology. As the human forces prepared to move to their next objective, one of the captured hostiles, a young human male who had been shooting at them less than an hour earlier, was provided with medical treatment for a gunshot wound to his shoulder. The medic treating him was Corporal Williams, a human female whose partner had been wounded during the assault on the building. "Why?" the captured hostile asked in heavily accented English as Corporal Williams applied field dressings to his wound. "Why do you help me? I tried to kill you." I tried to kill your friends. Corporal Williams continued working on his wound with practiced efficiency. Because you're hurt and I'm a medic. That's what medics do. But I am your enemy. Right now, you're my patient. We can sort out the enemy part later, but first we keep you from bleeding out. The captured hostile was quiet for several minutes as she worked. Finally, he said, my brother told me you Americans only care about killing. He said you enjoy watching others suffer. Your brother was wrong about some things, Corporal Williams said without looking up from her work. What's your name? Omar. Well, Omar, I don't enjoy watching anybody suffer. That's kind of the whole point of being a medic. You got family back home worried about you? My mother. My younger sister. Then, let's make sure you get to see them again, okay? This war won't last forever, but mothers missing their sons lasts a lifetime. Omar was quiet until she finished treating his wound. As she prepared to move him to the prisoner collection point, he said, Corporal Williams? Yeah. My brother was wrong about more than just some things. Zeftai struggled to process what he had witnessed. Providing medical care to captured enemies was not unprecedented. Many species recognized the strategic value of demonstrating restraint toward defeated opponents. But the interaction between Corporal Williams and Omar suggested something far more complex than tactical psychological operations. The conversation had been personal, emotional, and entirely genuine. Corporal Williams had not been following a protocol designed to extract information or demonstrate propaganda value. She had been treating a wounded individual as a wounded individual, regardless of his previous actions or affiliations. More puzzling was Omar's response. In Zeftai's experience, captured combatants typically reacted to medical treatment with suspicion, assuming it was a prelude to interrogation or a psychological manipulation technique. Omar's reaction suggested not just surprise, but a fundamental re-evaluation of his assumptions about his captors. Over the following cycles, Zeftai tracked the outcomes of this single operation. Omar provided intelligence that led to the dismantling of 3 separate explosive device manufacturing locations. More significantly, he eventually became what human intelligence services called a turned asset, a former hostile who actively worked to prevent attacks against both military and civilian targets. But the most significant outcome was something that took Zeftai weeks to understand. Word of Omar's treatment spread through local networks, and the number of voluntary surrenders in the region increased by approximately 40% over the next 2 months. Hostile forces began approaching human positions under white flags, requesting negotiations rather than fighting to the death. The tactical decision to treat captured enemies with medical care and basic dignity had transformed the entire strategic environment of the region. This was impossible according to every military doctrine Zeftai had studied. Showing restraint toward enemies was supposed to be interpreted as weakness, encouraging further attacks and emboldening hostile forces. Providing aid and comfort to captured combatants was supposed to drain resources and demonstrate that hostile actions would not result in serious consequences. But the humans had somehow turned restraint into a weapon, compassion into a strategic advantage, and medical care into an intelligence asset. As he prepared his reports for the second cycle, Zeftai found himself unable to categorize what he was observing. The humans weren't just conducting military operations with unusual ethical constraints. They were using those ethical constraints as tactical advantages, turning their refusal to abandon their humanity into a force multiplier that made them more effective, not less. They were fighting harder because they refused to stop caring about their enemies. During his 3rd week in the Fallujah region, Zeftai observed an incident that finally convinced him he was dealing with something unprecedented in galactic history. An improvised explosive device detonated near a human patrol, severely wounding 2 soldiers and trapping a 3rd under debris. As the patrol responded to the attack, they came under small arms fire from concealed positions in nearby buildings. Standard doctrine for such situations was clear: suppress hostile fire, evacuate wounded personnel, call for reinforcement and area effect weapons to neutralize the threat. But, as the firefight developed, the patrol leader received information that changed everything. Alpha 26, this is Overwatch. Be advised, we're picking up thermal signatures consistent with children in the building where hostile fire is originating. Count approximately 6 to 8 small signatures, probably families sheltering in place. Copy, Overwatch. Can you confirm hostile positions versus civilian positions? Negative, Alpha 26. Thermal interference from the building materials makes precise location impossible. Hostiles appear to be firing from positions directly adjacent to or intermixed with civilian locations. What happened next violated every tactical principle Zeftai understood. Instead of calling in precision strikes that would eliminate the hostile fire but might endanger civilians, the patrol leader made a decision that prioritized the safety of unknown non-combatants over the immediate tactical advantage of his own forces. Overwatch, Alpha 26. We're going to clear this building by hand. I need medical evacuation for our wounded, and I need civilian evacuation assets standing by. We're going in soft. Alpha 26, be advised you are taking heavy fire from unknown number of hostiles in defensive positions. Recommend immediate precision strike on the building. Negative, Overwatch. Not with kids inside. We'll do this the hard way. The hard way involved a coordinated assault that took over 2 hours to complete, during which the human forces sustained additional casualties, expended significant resources, and operated at extreme tactical disadvantage. But, when the building was finally secured, they had successfully evacuated 13 civilians, including 7 children under the age of 12. They had captured 4 hostile combatants alive. And, most significantly, they had demonstrated to the local population that human forces would accept significant personal risk rather than endanger civilian lives. The strategic consequences of this decision became apparent over the following weeks. Intelligence reports indicated a dramatic increase in civilian cooperation with human forces throughout the region. Tips about explosive device locations increased by over 60%. Reports of hostile movement and equipment caches tripled. Most importantly, recruitment for hostile organizations in the region declined precipitously. The tactical decision to prioritize civilian safety over immediate military advantage had fundamentally altered the strategic environment of the entire area of operations. Zeftai realized he was observing something that challenged the basic assumptions of military science. The humans had developed a form of warfare that became more effective the more they refused to compromise their ethical principles. They were winning not despite their constraints, but because of them. They had weaponized their own humanity. As his second cycle of observation concluded, Zeftai faced a disturbing conclusion. These weren't primitive bipeds learning to wage war. These were sophisticated strategists who had developed a military doctrine that treated ethics as tactics, compassion as strategy, and restraint as a force multiplier. They were fighting wars in ways that made them stronger, not weaker. Wars that made them more human, not less. And, if they could do that in small-scale conflicts against technologically inferior opponents, what would they be capable of when facing existential threats? What would humans become when everything they cared about was truly at stake? Zeftai began preparing for his third cycle of observation with a growing sense that he was documenting something far more dangerous than anyone at the Confederation had imagined. Not because humans were good at killing, but because they had learned how to fight without losing their souls, and that made them capable of anything. Zeftai's third cycle took him to what humans called Somalia, a region experiencing what their military classified as humanitarian intervention in a failed state environment. The mission briefings described widespread civilian suffering, breakdown of governmental authority, and multiple armed factions competing for control of territory and resources. According to Confederation protocols for observing developing species, this type of scenario typically provided excellent opportunities to assess both military capabilities and moral flexibility under extreme stress. Based on his previous observations, Zeftai expected to witness more examples of the peculiar human tendency to prioritize ethical considerations over tactical efficiency. What he discovered instead was something that fundamentally altered his understanding of what humans become when their core values are threatened. The observation pod settled into position above a coastal city called Mogadishu during what human records would later designate as the Battle of the Black Sea. Intelligence intercepts had indicated that local warlords had been systematically preventing humanitarian aid from reaching civilian populations, using starvation as a weapon of control and deliberately targeting international relief workers. For the humans, this represented something qualitatively different from the territorial and ideological conflicts Zeftai had previously observed. This was not war over resources, land, or political control. This was war over the right of innocent people to simply survive. What Zeftai witnessed in Somalia was the first time he observed humans when they stopped treating warfare as a complex problem requiring balanced solutions and started treating it as an existential struggle between fundamentally incompatible moral systems. The mission that changed everything began when a human medical unit, operating under international humanitarian protocols, was deliberately targeted while treating civilian casualties at a makeshift hospital. Zeftai's sensors recorded the attack in horrific detail. Armed militants, identified as forces loyal to local warlord Mohammed Farhat Aidid, had surrounded the medical facility during active treatment operations. Rather than demanding surrender or attempting to capture strategic assets, they had opened fire directly on medical personnel, wounded civilians, and children. Dr. Sarah Chen, the lead physician, had been killed while attempting to shield a Somali child from automatic weapons fire. Nurse Marcus Thompson had died trying to evacuate patients who were too injured to move themselves. In total, 7 international humanitarian workers and over 20 civilian patients had been killed in what was clearly a deliberate attack on protected medical personnel. For 48 hours after the attack, Zeftai monitored human communications expecting to see either tactical withdrawal from the region or escalation through standard military response protocols. Instead, what he observed was something unprecedented in his experience. Complete silence. The human military communications networks, normally filled with routine operational chatter, tactical updates, and administrative coordination, went completely quiet. No movement orders. No operational planning discussions. No requests for reinforcement or resource allocation. Just silence. When communication resumed 48 hours later, everything had changed. All units, this is command authority. Operation Restore Hope is now designated Operation Gothic Serpent. Rules of engagement are modified as follows. Any individual or group actively preventing humanitarian aid delivery, threatening protected medical personnel, or targeting civilian populations is designated hostile and will be engaged with all necessary force to eliminate the threat. No exceptions. No negotiations. No warnings required. Command Authority, Delta Force acknowledges new ROE. Request confirmation, we are authorized to engage any threat to humanitarian operations with lethal force? Delta Force, that is confirmed. You are authorized and directed to eliminate any individual or group that threatens civilian populations or humanitarian operations. The mission is no longer peacekeeping. The mission is now to ensure that innocent people receive the help they need to survive. Whatever it takes. Zeftai realized he was observing something fundamentally different from everything he had witnessed before. The restrained, ethically complex approach he had documented in Afghanistan and Iraq had been replaced by something far more direct and infinitely more dangerous. The humans had decided that some things were not subject to compromise. The first major operation under the new rules of engagement took place 72 hours later, when intelligence identified a convoy of vehicles carrying medical supplies and food aid that was being intercepted by armed militias approximately 40 kilometers outside Mogadishu. In Afghanistan or Iraq, human forces would have developed a complex operational plan designed to neutralize the threat while minimizing casualties, preserving infrastructure, and maintaining positive relationships with local populations. They would have spent days developing intelligence, coordinating with local authorities, and planning precision operations that balanced multiple competing objectives. In Somalia, they did something entirely different. The convoy was being held by approximately 30 armed militants at a checkpoint they had established to extort humanitarian supplies. Standard doctrine suggested either negotiation for the supplies release or a precision operation to neutralize the threat and recover the materials. Instead, the human response was swift, comprehensive, and absolutely terrifying. Within 6 hours of receiving the intelligence report, human forces had identified every individual involved in intercepting humanitarian aid in a 50-kilometer radius around Mogadishu. Not just the immediate threat to the convoy, but every person, group, and organization that had been involved in preventing aid delivery over the previous 6 months. The operation began at exactly 0400 local time with simultaneous strikes on 17 different targets throughout the region. not precision strikes designed to minimize casualties or preserve infrastructure, but comprehensive elimination operations designed to permanently remove every threat to humanitarian operations in the area. Zeftai watched in fascination and growing alarm as human forces demonstrated capabilities he had not previously observed. The restraint, the careful consideration of civilian casualties, the elaborate efforts to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants that had characterized their previous operations were completely absent. Instead, they approached the problem of protecting humanitarian operations with the same methodical efficiency that other species reserved for existential warfare. The checkpoint holding the aid convoy was eliminated in 43 seconds by precision artillery fire that left no survivors. The weapons storage facility that had supplied arms to anti-humanitarian militias was destroyed by guided munitions that created a crater visible from orbital altitude. The command center coordinating attacks on relief workers was located in a densely populated urban area, and human forces cleared a 6-block radius of civilian populations before leveling the entire structure with controlled demolitions. By 1200 local time, organized resistance to humanitarian operations in the Mogadishu region had been completely eliminated. But what disturbed Zeftai most was not the efficiency of the operations, but the complete absence of moral complexity that had characterized previous human military actions. There had been no lengthy discussions about rules of engagement, no careful consideration of proportional response, no agonizing over civilian casualties or long-term strategic implications. The humans had identified a threat to innocent people receiving life-saving assistance, and they had eliminated that threat with the same methodical certainty that a surgeon removes a malignant tumor. When local warlord Mohammed Farah Aidid demanded negotiations and threatened to execute captured relief workers if the attacks continued, the human response was delivered through a single radio transmission that Zeftai recorded and analyzed for weeks afterward. "This is General William Garrison, commander of Task Force Ranger. There will be no negotiations. There will be no prisoner exchanges. There will be no discussions about terms or conditions. Every person under your command who has prevented humanitarian aid from reaching civilian populations will be located and eliminated. Every weapon, vehicle, and facility you control that has been used to threaten relief operations will be destroyed. You have 48 hours to release any captured aid workers and withdraw from all humanitarian distribution sites. After 48 hours, you will be treated as a priority target for immediate elimination. This is your only warning." For Zeftai, who had spent months observing humans negotiate with enemies, treat captured combatants with medical care, and risk their own lives to prevent civilian casualties, this transformation was profoundly disturbing. These were the same individuals who had spent hours ensuring that children weren't present in buildings before conducting assault operations. The same species that had provided medical treatment to enemies who had been shooting at them minutes earlier. The same military forces that had accepted significant tactical disadvantages rather than endanger unknown civilian populations. But, when the fundamental principle of protecting innocent life was directly threatened, all of that complexity had vanished. Aidid tested the ultimatum. 49 hours later, his compound was located through signals intelligence and destroyed by a coordinated strike that left a crater 40 meters wide. Aidid's body was never found because there wasn't enough left to identify. Within 2 weeks of the modified rules of engagement, humanitarian aid was flowing freely throughout Somalia. Civilian casualties from starvation and preventable disease dropped to near zero. International relief organizations were able to operate without fear of attack or extortion. The human approach had been brutally effective, but what troubled Zeftai was the realization that it represented something far more complex than simple military escalation. The humans hadn't abandoned their ethics. They had weaponized them. When protecting innocent life required restraint and careful consideration, they had demonstrated extraordinary tactical patience and moral sophistication. When protecting innocent life required swift and overwhelming elimination of threats, they had demonstrated the capacity for methodical violence that surpassed anything Zeftai had observed in 43 different military traditions. The ethical framework hadn't changed. The implementation had simply adapted to the requirements of the situation. During his final week in Somalia, Zeftai observed an incident that crystallized his growing understanding of what made human military doctrine truly dangerous. A group of children, displaced by the conflict and suffering from severe malnutrition, had approached a human aid distribution point. Among them was a young boy, approximately 10 solar cycles old, who had been weaponized by local militants, fitted with explosives and instructed to detonate himself among the relief workers. In any military scenario Zeftai had studied, the appropriate response would have been immediate elimination of the threat to prevent casualties among friendly forces and civilian populations. But the human response was something entirely different. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, the soldier responsible for security at the distribution point, identified the threat through careful observation of the child's behavior and the suspicious bulkiness of his clothing. Rather than eliminating the threat, she approached the child directly. "Hey there, little guy. You look scared. What's your name?" The child, programmed to detonate the device when he reached the aid station, was clearly confused by the direct personal interaction. I am supposed to go to the white trucks. Those are the trucks with food and medicine. Are you hungry? Yes. But I have to. I am supposed to. Staff Sergeant Santos knelt down to his eye level, positioning herself between the child and the other civilians at the distribution point. "You're supposed to what, sweetheart?" The boy began crying. "Bad men said I have to push the button when I get to the trucks. They said it would help my family. But I don't want to push the button. I just want food for my sister." What followed was a 20-minute conversation during which Staff Sergeant Santos talked a 10-year-old suicide bomber through disarming himself while positioned close enough that his detonation would have killed them both. She never backed away. Never called for bomb disposal experts. Never attempted to secure the area or evacuate civilians. Instead, she sat with a child who had been turned into a weapon and helped him remember that he was still a child. "What's your sister's name?" "Amara. She is only 6. She cries because she is so hungry." "Well, let's make sure Amara gets some food today, okay? But first, we need to get this thing off of you so it doesn't hurt anybody by accident. Will you really give food to Amara?" "I promise. You and Amara will both get food today. But I need you to be very brave and help me with this, okay?" The child successfully disarmed the explosive device with Staff Sergeant Santos's guidance. Both children received medical treatment and were placed in protective custody. The intelligence gathered from the incident led to the elimination of the militant cell that had been weaponizing children. But what made the incident truly significant was what happened next. Word of how the human soldier had treated the weaponized child spread throughout the region. Over the next month, 17 other children who had been fitted with explosive devices voluntarily approached human aid stations and requested help disarming themselves. The tactical decision to treat a suicide bomber as a child in need of help had eliminated an entire strategy of child weaponization in the region. As his third cycle of observation concluded, Zeftai realized he was documenting something unprecedented in galactic military history. The humans had developed a military doctrine that became more dangerous the more it refused to compromise its core ethical principles. They fought harder when protecting innocent life. They were more ruthless when defending the defenseless. They became more effective the more they insisted on remaining human. And, when those core principles were threatened, they were capable of switching from complex ethical considerations to methodical elimination of threats without losing their fundamental nature. They had somehow learned to be absolutely ruthless in defense of absolute compassion. Zeftai began preparing for his fourth cycle of observation with the growing certainty that he was documenting something that would change everything the Confederation understood about warfare, intelligence, and survival. These weren't primitive bipeds learning military doctrine. These were sophisticated predators who had learned to hunt in defense of prey. And that made them capable of anything. Zeftai's fourth cycle brought him to what would prove to be the most disturbing observation of his entire mission, a human military research facility designated Building 2847, Joint Base Lewis McChord, Washington State. Intelligence suggested this location housed what humans called their Military Ethics Research Division, a concept so paradoxical that Confederation linguists had initially classified it as a translation error. No military organization in galactic history had ever established formal research protocols for ethical warfare. Ethics and military effectiveness were universally understood to be inversely correlated variables. The more ethical constraints a military force accepted, the less effective it became. The more effective a military force needed to be, the more ethical considerations had to be abandoned. This was fundamental military science, verified across thousands of species and millions of conflict scenarios. But, as Zeftai settled his observation pod above the research facility, he began to understand that humans had somehow developed something that violated these fundamental principles. They had created a systematic approach to making ethics and effectiveness mutually reinforcing rather than contradictory. They had weaponized moral philosophy. The research facility appeared unremarkable from external observation, a collection of administrative buildings, computer labs, and conference facilities that could have belonged to any academic or corporate research complex. But, the electromagnetic signatures indicated computational resources that rivaled some planetary defense networks, and the security protocols suggested information classification levels typically reserved for strategic weapons research. Through careful monitoring of their communications and data networks, Zeftai discovered that the facility was engaged in research that challenged everything he understood about military science. Project designation: Moral Calculus Initiative. Objective: develop quantitative models for optimizing military effectiveness through ethical constraint enhancement. Primary hypothesis: military operations achieve maximum strategic effectiveness when ethical considerations are integrated as tactical advantages rather than operational limitations. The research team included military strategists, moral philosophers, behavioral psychologists, game theory mathematicians, cultural anthropologists, and combat veterans from multiple conflict zones. They were attempting to solve what they called the compassion victory paradox, the apparent contradiction between ethical behavior and military success. What Zeftai discovered was that they were succeeding. Dr. Rebecca Hassan, the project's lead philosopher, was presenting research findings that documented patterns Zeftai had observed but never understood. Through analysis of military operations spanning over 50 years of human conflict, her team had identified measurable correlations between ethical behavior and strategic success that defied conventional military wisdom. The data is unambiguous, Dr. Hassan explained to the assembled research team. Military units that maintain strict ethical protocols during combat operations demonstrate consistently superior strategic outcomes compared to units that prioritize tactical efficiency over moral considerations. This isn't correlation, we can demonstrate causation through multiple independent variables. General Patricia Reynolds, the project's military director, reviewed the statistical analysis with obvious skepticism. Rebecca, this contradicts every principle of military science we've developed over centuries of warfare. How can accepting constraints make us more effective? Because the constraints aren't limitations, Dr. Hassan replied. They're force multipliers. When we refuse to abandon our ethical principles, we don't become weaker, we become something our enemies can't predict, can't understand, and ultimately can't defeat. The presentation continued with case studies that documented the phenomenon Zeftai had witnessed across multiple theaters. Military operations that prioritized civilian protection generated intelligence cooperation that eliminated enemy support networks. Treatment of captured enemies according to ethical protocols produced strategic intelligence that precision bombing could never achieve. Restraint in the use of overwhelming force created political advantages that lasted decades beyond immediate tactical objectives. But, the most disturbing aspect of the research was their systematic approach to optimizing what they called compassionate lethality. Dr. James Chen, the project's tactical analysis specialist, presented findings that made Zeftai question everything he thought he understood about human nature. We've identified the mathematical principles that govern optimal ethical warfare, Dr. Chen explained. The key insight is that humans fight more effectively when they're fighting for something rather than against something. When military operations are framed as protection of innocent life rather than elimination of enemy forces, psychological and tactical performance increases by an average of 47%. The research had quantified what Zeftai had observed anecdotally. Humans became more dangerous when they were defending others than when they were attacking enemies. Their tactical effectiveness increased proportionally with their emotional investment in protecting innocent life. They had calculated the mathematics of mercy and discovered it was a strategic weapon. General Reynolds examined the tactical applications with the focused attention of a career military professional. James, walk me through the practical implementation. How do we apply these principles in active combat operations? The model suggests three primary optimization strategies, Dr. Chen replied. First, frame every mission in terms of protection rather than destruction. Instead of eliminate enemy forces, mission objectives become protect civilian populations from enemy forces. Second, integrate humanitarian considerations into tactical planning from the beginning rather than treating them as constraints to work around. Third, maximize opportunities for enemy forces to surrender or withdraw rather than fight to the death. And this makes us more effective? Demonstrably. Units operating under protection-focused mission parameters complete objectives 23% faster, sustain 16% fewer casualties, and generate 41% more actionable intelligence than units operating under traditional destruction-focused parameters. The research continued with analysis that gradually revealed the true scope of human military evolution. They hadn't just developed ethical constraints on warfare, they had developed ethical enhancements to warfare. Dr. Sarah Kim, the project's behavioral psychologist, presented research on what they called adaptive moral architecture, the human capacity to maintain ethical frameworks while adapting tactical approaches to specific threats. The critical insight is that ethical principles don't constrain tactical flexibility, they guide tactical innovation, Dr. Kim explained. When humans are committed to protecting innocent life, they develop tactical solutions that are simultaneously more sophisticated and more effective than conventional approaches. She presented case studies from Somalia that documented exactly what Zeftai had observed. When human forces encountered threats to humanitarian operations, their response had been swift and devastating, but also precisely calibrated to eliminate only those threats while preserving everything else. The key psychological factor is what we call protective aggression, Dr. Kim continued. Humans become exponentially more dangerous when they're defending others than when they're advancing their own interests. This isn't just emotional, it's cognitive. Protective motivation enhances tactical creativity, strategic planning, and operational persistence in measurable ways. General Reynolds asked the question that Zeftai had been considering throughout his observation mission: what are the implications if we scale this approach beyond small unit operations? What happens when entire military organizations adopt these principles? The answer came from Dr. Michael Torres, the project's strategic modeling specialist, and it confirms Zeftai's growing fears about human military potential. Simulation results suggest that a military organization operating under optimal ethical constraint parameters would be effectively undefeatable by conventional forces, Dr. Torres reported. The combination of enhanced tactical effectiveness, superior intelligence gathering, and strategic political advantages creates what our models classify as asymmetric ethical superiority. Meaning what, exactly? Meaning that an ethically optimized military force doesn't just win battles, it wins wars before the shooting starts. Enemy forces can't maintain morale against an opponent that demonstrably protects their civilians better than they do. Enemy populations can't support military leaders who are visibly less ethical than their opponents. Enemy intelligence networks collapse when captured operatives are treated better by enemies than by their own command structures. The research had identified something unprecedented in galactic military science, a military doctrine that became more effective the more ethical it became, and more dangerous the more it prioritized protection over destruction. Dr. Hassan presented the final component of their research: case studies of what happened when human military forces encountered threats to their core ethical principles. Our analysis of historical data reveals a pattern we called moral singularity events, she explained. When human military forces encounter threats that directly challenge their fundamental commitment to protecting innocent life, their tactical and strategic behavior transforms in ways that our conventional models can't predict or contain. She presented analysis of human responses to genocide, systematic targeting of civilians, and deliberate use of humanitarian crises as weapons of war. In each case, human military forces had abandoned their typical complex ethical calculations and adopted what the researchers classified as absolute moral clarity. During moral singularity events, human forces become tactically unpredictable, strategically relentless, and operationally unstoppable, Dr. Hassan continued. They don't just defeat enemies, they eliminate the possibility of similar threats emerging again. Permanently. General Reynolds studied the historical examples with obvious concern. Rebecca, these case studies suggest capabilities that go far beyond conventional military doctrine. We're talking about transformation of entire regions, elimination of ideologies, and permanent alteration of political structures. Correct. When humans encounter direct threats to innocent life, they don't just respond tactically, they respond existentially. They don't just eliminate immediate threats, they engineer solutions that prevent similar threats from ever emerging again. The research concluded with predictive modeling that made Zeftai understand why this information was classified at the highest levels of human government. Dr. Torres presented scenarios for what human military forces would become if they encountered existential threats to human civilization itself. The models suggested tactical capabilities that would make current human military forces appear primitive by comparison. If humans were to encounter an existential threat, invasion, genocide, or systematic elimination of human populations, our models predict the emergence of what we classify as species-level protective aggression, Dr. Torres explained. The same psychological and tactical mechanisms we've observed in small unit operations would scale to encompass entire civilizations. What would that look like practically? Complete mobilization of human technological, intellectual, and creative capabilities in service of eliminating the existential threat. Not just military mobilization, civilizational mobilization. Every human capacity for innovation, cooperation, and problem-solving focused on the single objective of ensuring human survival and the protection of human values. The research indicated that humans facing existential threats wouldn't just fight harder, they would become something qualitatively different. A species that combined their capacity for ethical reasoning with their capacity for absolute ruthlessness when protecting others. As Zeftai concluded his monitoring of the research facility, he realized he had been documenting something that posed unprecedented challenges to Confederation security doctrine. Humans hadn't just developed effective military forces. They had developed a military philosophy that made them more dangerous the more ethical they became. They had learned to fight in ways that made them stronger, smarter, and more creative rather than more destructive and less human. Most critically, they had identified the conditions under which they would stop playing by conventional rules of warfare entirely. If humans ever encountered threats that directly challenged their core commitment to protecting innocent life, they would become something that no conventional military force could predict, understand, or defeat. They would become a species entirely dedicated to eliminating anything that threatened the defenseless. And they would have the ethical justification, tactical creativity, and strategic persistence to succeed. Zeftai began preparing for his final cycle of observation with the growing certainty that he was documenting a species that represented either the greatest hope for galactic civilization or its greatest threat. Possibly both. The humans had learned to make war in defense of peace, to be ruthless in protection of compassion, and to become absolutely dangerous when defending absolute values. That made them capable of anything, including things that would change the galaxy forever. Zeftai's final cycle of observation began with what appeared to be routine monitoring of human space exploration activities around their home star system. According to Confederation protocols, this should have been a purely academic exercise documenting the primitive space technology of a pre-warp species for anthropological records. But, after 4 cycles of observing human military doctrine, Zeftai had learned that nothing involving humans followed conventional patterns. The observation pods settled into position near what humans called the asteroid belt to monitor their resource extraction and orbital construction projects. The technology was impressive for a species that had only recently achieved chemical rocket propulsion, automated mining systems, modular construction techniques, and primitive but functional rotating habitats. Standard development patterns for a species roughly 50 years from achieving faster-than-light travel. What Zeftai didn't expect was to witness the moment when human development patterns stopped being standard forever. The first indication that something unprecedented was occurring came through deep space monitoring networks that detected an anomalous energy signature approaching the Sol system from galactic coordinates that corresponded to hegemony territory. The Vacti hegemony was not supposed to have any interest in Sol 3. According to Confederation records, the hegemony had classified the system as negligible strategic value, primitive life forms, quarantine recommended until natural development of interstellar capabilities. But, as Zeftai tracked the approaching energy signature, he realized this was not a scientific survey mission. The sensor profile matched a hegemony pacification fleet, the standard formation deployed for preemptive elimination of species that showed potential for future threat development. 3 battlecruisers, 47 combat ships, and support vessels configured for planetary bombardment and resource extraction. Zeftai immediately accessed Confederation databases to determine why the hegemony would consider Sol 3 a threat requiring preemptive elimination. What he discovered was an intelligence report filed by Confederation Reconnaissance Forces 3 cycles earlier, describing unusual military development patterns suggesting potential future aggressive expansion capabilities. The report had been filed by Commander Vexnari of the 47th Reconnaissance Wing, and it described observations of human military doctrine that matched everything Zeftai had witnessed. But, where Zeftai had documented human ethical warfare as an unprecedented development in military philosophy, Commander Vexnari had interpreted it as evidence of a species developing dangerously effective militaristic capabilities with high probability of future galactic expansion and conquest activities. The Confederation had shared this assessment with hegemony intelligence services as part of standard information exchange protocols. The hegemony had interpreted unusually effective military doctrine as justification for preemptive elimination of a potential future threat. In approximately 72 hours, the hegemony fleet would arrive at Sol 3 and commence what they classified as prophylactic sterilization of the human species. Zeftai faced an immediate crisis. Confederation protocols strictly prohibited any contact with pre-warp species under any circumstances. Interference with natural development patterns was considered a violation of fundamental galactic law. But, the approaching fleet represented something qualitatively different from natural development. It was active elimination of a species that had committed no aggressive acts against any galactic civilization. More critically, Zeftai realized that the hegemony had made their targeting decision based on incomplete and fundamentally incorrect assessment of human capabilities. They were expecting to encounter a militaristic species that had developed unusually effective conventional warfare capabilities. They were not prepared for what humans actually were, a species that had learned to fight more effectively by refusing to abandon their ethical principles. The hegemony was about to attack a species that would become exponentially more dangerous when defending innocent life. After 18 hours of internal debate, Zeftai made a decision that violated every protocol he had been trained to follow. He established communication with human space monitoring networks and transmitted a carefully constructed warning about the approaching threat. The initial human response confirmed everything Zeftai had observed about their approach to unexpected challenges. Houston Control, this is Space Force Command. We're showing an unidentified signal on deep space monitoring arrays. Signal appears to be directed at Earth from coordinates approximately 47 AU outsystem. Pattern suggests attempted communication rather than natural phenomenon. Copy, Space Force Command. Signal is confirmed on multiple arrays. Linguistics teams are attempting pattern analysis for meaning extraction. Houston, we're also detecting anomalous energy signatures approaching from the same vector. Signatures are consistent with artificial constructs, possibly spacecraft. Multiple contacts, estimated arrival 71 hours. The human response to discovering alien contact followed protocols that demonstrated the same ethical framework Zeftai had observed in their military operations. All agencies, this is National Command Authority. Situation: possible first contact with non-terrestrial intelligence. Priority 1, determine peaceful or hostile intent. Priority 2, prepare defensive measures while maintaining open communication channels. Priority 3, coordinate international response through United Nations protocols. Remember, people, this is the moment we've been preparing for. We handle this right, and we represent all of humanity. Let's show them who we really are. Within 6 hours, human governments had established unified command protocols, activated their most sophisticated space-based detection systems, and begun coordinating response plans that prioritized diplomacy over military action. But, as they decoded Zeftai's warning message and began to understand the nature of the approaching threat, something began to change in human communication patterns that made Zeftai realize he had initiated something unprecedented in galactic history. All stations, this is USSPACCOM. We have completed linguistic analysis of the alien communication. The message warns of an approaching fleet of 49 vessels with intent to eliminate human civilization. Estimated arrival 68 hours. The sender identifies as a reconnaissance observer from something called the Galactic Confederation and claims this attack is based on incorrect assessment of human military capabilities. Spacecom, this is UN Security Council emergency session. Confirm, we are facing imminent alien invasion with intent to commit genocide against human species? That is correct, UN Security Council. And, according to the warning message, this attack is happening because another alien civilization thinks we're too dangerous to be allowed to survive. What happened next violated every pattern of behavior Zeftai had observed in galactic civilizations' responses to existential threats. Instead of panic, despair, or chaotic mobilization, humans began implementing response protocols that demonstrated the same systematic ethical framework they apply to smaller-scale conflicts. All stations, this is President Chen. The situation is unprecedented, but our response is not. We will defend human civilization through every means necessary. But we will do so in ways that honor human values. We will not become the militaristic threat that prompted this attack. We will show them exactly why their assessment of humanity was wrong. United Nations Emergency Assembly is in session. Priority objectives: first, exhaust all diplomatic options for peaceful resolution. Second, coordinate global defense preparations. Third, ensure civilian protection and evacuation protocols are ready for implementation. Fourth, maintain accurate documentation of all events for historical record and potential survivor communities. But, as human defensive preparations continued, Zeftai began observing capabilities that had not been apparent during his monitoring of terrestrial conflicts. Human space-based industry had been developing for over 3 decades, but its true scale had been concealed from casual observation. What appeared to be modest asteroid mining operations were actually comprehensive resource extraction systems capable of producing industrial materials in quantities that rivaled planetary manufacturing capacity. The orbital construction facilities that seemed to be building simple research stations were actually modular manufacturing systems that could be rapidly reconfigured for any production requirement. Most significantly, the human space transportation network that appeared to consist of primitive chemical rockets was actually a comprehensive orbital infrastructure that could move massive resources throughout the solar system with remarkable efficiency. Humans had not just achieved space travel, they had quietly colonized their entire star system. As the countdown to the hegemony fleet's arrival continued, Zeftai watched human defensive preparations with growing amazement and alarm. Rather than concentrating their defenses around Earth, humans began implementing distributed resistance strategies that treated their entire solar system as a single defensive network. Manufacturing facilities throughout the asteroid belt began producing what their engineers called defensive countermeasures at a rate that suggested manufacturing capabilities far beyond what orbital surveys had indicated. But, most disturbing was the systematic way humans integrated their ethical principles into their defensive planning. Defense Planning Committee, this is Admiral Sarah Hassan. I want to be absolutely clear about our objectives. We are not trying to destroy the incoming fleet, we are trying to protect innocent human life. If we can achieve that protection through deterrence, negotiation, or demonstration of defensive capability, those options are preferable to destruction of alien forces. Admiral, what if diplomatic solutions are not possible? Then, we implement protection through elimination of threat. But, our goal remains the protection of human civilization, not the destruction of alien civilization. We fight to save, not to destroy. The human defensive strategy incorporated the same approach Zeftai had observed in Somalia: absolute clarity about core objectives combined with tactical flexibility about implementation methods. As the hegemony fleet approached the outer edge of the Sol system, humans transmitted carefully constructed diplomatic communications in multiple languages, mathematical patterns, and symbolic representations designed to communicate peaceful intent while demonstrating technological sophistication. The hegemony response was exactly what Confederation military doctrine predicted for a pacification mission: complete communication silence followed by immediate engagement protocols. What happened next changed galactic civilization forever. The first hegemony battlecruiser to enter the asteroid belt region encountered defensive systems that should not have existed. Instead of the primitive orbital installations their intelligence had predicted, they found a distributed network of defensive platforms that demonstrated technological sophistication comparable to advanced galactic civilizations. But, the truly unprecedented aspect of human defense was not their technology, it was their strategy. Rather than attempting to destroy the hegemony fleet, human forces implemented what they called non-lethal incapacitation protocols. Using a combination of electromagnetic pulse weapons, directed energy systems, and precision kinetic impacts, they systematically disabled hegemony vessels without destroying them. Within 4 hours, the entire hegemony fleet had been rendered completely non-operational, but with minimal casualties among alien crews. Then, humans did something that violated every principle of military doctrine Zeftai had studied across 43 different species. They provided emergency assistance to the disabled enemy fleet. Hegemony vessels, this is Earth Defense Coordination. Your ships have been disabled to prevent hostile action against civilian populations, but we detect life support failures on multiple vessels. We are dispatching emergency aid ships to provide life support assistance, medical aid, and rescue services for crew members in distress. Please respond if you can receive this transmission. The first alien crews to be rescued by human emergency response teams encountered the same approach to defeated enemies that Zeftai had observed in terrestrial conflicts. Medical aid, basic humanitarian assistance, and treatment as individuals in need of help rather than simply defeated enemies. But, the strategic implications of human defensive success extended far beyond the immediate military engagement. By defeating the hegemony fleet without destroying it, humans had demonstrated technological capabilities that required immediate reassessment of their development status. By providing aid to defeated enemies, they had demonstrated ethical principles that challenged fundamental assumptions about militaristic species development. Most critically, they had proven that the hegemony assessment of human threat potential had been simultaneously completely wrong and absolutely accurate. Wrong because humans were not a militaristic species developing conventional aggressive expansion capabilities. Accurate because they represented something far more dangerous, a species that could defend itself against galactic-level threats while maintaining ethical principles that made conventional military doctrine irrelevant. As news of the human defensive victory spread through galactic communication networks, Zeftai realized he was witnessing the end of humanity's quarantine period and the beginning of something unprecedented in galactic history. A species had achieved galactic-level military capability while maintaining pre-contact ethical development. They had become powerful enough to defend themselves against galactic civilizations without losing the moral framework that made them worth defending. The Confederation would have to decide whether humans represented the greatest hope for galactic civilization or its greatest threat. But, as Zeftai compiled his final reports, he realized the question was irrelevant. Humans were no longer asking permission to exist. They had proven they had the right to determine their own destiny, the capability to defend that right, and the ethical framework to use that capability responsibly. The galaxy would have to learn to coexist with a species that had solved the fundamental problem of power, how to be strong enough to protect everything you value without becoming something that destroys everything you are. Zeftai's final transmission to Confederation Command was simple: recommend immediate reclassification of Sol 3 inhabitants from quarantined developing species to independent galactic civilization. Threat assessment: minimal to allies, existential to aggressors. Recommend immediate diplomatic contact and full membership negotiation. The age of human isolation was over. The age of galactic cooperation was about to begin. And the galaxy would never be the same.